So this is the bandsaw. A lot of shop machines or handheld power tools are named according to the shape of the saw blade. And so this one's called a bandsaw because the saw blade itself is literally a band that goes around on these two wheels here, which is kind of cool. Sometimes you have to switch out the blade for another one, especially if you're working with metal versus wood. You've got your power buttons over here. Again, there might be some kind of system that you have to like switch on first and then do your power buttons. Oh, it's magnetic. Oh. This is a little guard in case you want to keep any wood chips out of your eyes, but theoretically you should be wearing safety glasses anyway. This guy is also a little rockety. That's not safe either. So I forget what this guy's called. It's basically, it's partly just a guard, but when nobody's using the saw, you want to make sure that it's down like this just for safety reasons. In the rare event, in the impossible event that someone trips in the shop and like falls into the blade, it's not going to happen, but safety. And so you can bring this guy up, and you want to set it so that it's just a little bit above the piece of wood that you're going to be cutting. You don't want to expose too much of the blade for, again, safety reasons. Don't be too scared by the bandsaw. It's really not that scary. And so you can actually get your hands pretty close here, but just be careful. You can use a push stick if you want to try, but unless you put a fence here, you don't really have anything to push up against. While you can make nice straight cuts with a bandsaw if you put a fence into that groove in the table, most people use bandsaws for making curved cuts or freehand cuts. Since it's a thinner blade, it has more of a flex to it, so you're better able to make curved cuts. If you don't have a lot of experience or confidence with a bandsaw, it can be difficult to make a really long cut like this. If something should go wrong, it's difficult to back your way back out of that cut. So you can make what are called relief cuts. So if you have this piece of wood and you want to cut along the dotted blue line, rather than just cutting straight through, you can make a series of smaller cuts that are perpendicular to that planned, that one big cut that you want to make. So make those little perpendicular cuts. And then when you come through and make that big cut, you're breaking off those little sections that you've created. And so that's a little bit less scary. It's a little better if something should go wrong, if you're not quite so confident with making a big cut yet. That's just a really good technique. Also, if you're doing a curve, if you're cutting a curve like this, making relief cuts can definitely help as well. Instead of trying to make that whole curve in one move can be a little bit tough. Bandsaws are great for cutting curves, but try to do it somewhat slowly. The speed that you see right here is pretty good. You don't want to bind up the blade too much. You don't want to make too drastic of a turn such that the blade gets all messed up. And then the other thing to remember is to wait until the blade stops before you reach in. So if you have like little scraps or whatever, and they're right up next to the blade, it sucks, but you have to wait for the blade to stop before you put your hands anywhere in there. Some bandsaws have a foot brakes that you can push down on, but even then, the blade's not going to stop immediately. And you definitely don't want to leave the machine until the blade has stopped. But yeah, so you can put a miter here or a fence of some kind here. You can make this table go at different angles if you need some kind of like 45-degree angle cut or something like that, though I would suggest using a miter saw for any of your like angled cuts. And so yeah, so you want to make sure that the teeth of the blade are going down so it's forcing your wood into the table. If you put the blade on the opposite way, it'll keep picking up your wood like this as you're trying to cut, and obviously that's not a good thing. A good thing is to draw the line that you want to cut on here and then cut a little bit outside of that line. And then, unless you're really good with the bandsaw, cut a little bit outside of that line and then sand it down the rest of the way. That's what people who haven't really done a whole lot with the bandsaw before might do. And so yeah, the only other thing about a bandsaw is you've got this guy here, which puts a real restriction on the size of wood that you can cut here. So if the piece of wood is like bigger than this table, if it's like too big to fit basically in this space, then you should really be using a table saw. So you can press your piece of wood up against the blade to account for the thickness of the blade when you're going to make that cut. But don't leave your piece of wood against the blade when you go to turn on the machine. There was a girl when I was in undergrad who did this with the table saw. She would put the piece of wood there to see, the thickness of the blade, exactly where it's going to hit according to the fence. And then she'd leave the wood there and bend over to turn the machine on, and the wood would get kicked back. That's what it's called. It'll get kicked back, and it comes back at you at like 60 miles an hour or 80 miles an hour or some ridiculous number, but it comes shooting back at you. Luckily, she had bent over to turn the machine on, so it flew back over her head, but she did this a couple times. She didn't learn, and it scared the crap out of me every time she tried to use the table saw. Especially for table saws, your crotch is right there. So if you don't want to get hit in the crotch with a piece of wood that comes kicking back at like 60 miles an hour, 80 miles an hour, or whatever, don't leave your piece of wood up against the blade. That's a good lesson, that you shouldn't have to learn the hard way. Do not learn that the hard way.